The last time the southern San Andreas produced a major earthquake was in the year 1857. That is 169 years of the Pacific and North American plates grinding past each other with nothing released. A study published last month put a number on what has been building ever since, and the number is staggering. The highest fault stress in Southern California in 1,000 years. The faults are loaded. What that means for Los Angeles is what we are going to walk through right now. A study published last month in the Journal of Geophysical Research has reached a conclusion that reframes how we should think about the ground beneath Southern California. After reconstructing roughly 1,000 years of movement on the region's major faults, a team of researchers found that the San Andreas and the San Jacinto fault systems are now carrying more accumulated stress than at any point in that entire record. Not more than last year, not more than in living memory, more than at any moment in the past 10 centuries. That is the finding, stated plainly. And it lands at a strange time because for the last few weeks, the news has been full of earthquakes in other parts of the world. And a lot of people have started to wonder whether the planet itself is doing something new. The honest answer to that larger question is no. The Earth is not waking up, and the global rate of large earthquakes has not changed. What has changed is our ability to measure the state of one specific, heavily populated fault system, and the measurement that just came back is not reassuring. So today, we are going to walk through exactly what this study found, how the researchers arrived at a number nobody has been able to put on paper before, and why the particular stretch of ground about 50 miles northeast of downtown Los Angeles has become the most closely watched fault junction in the country. And then we are going to look at 2 earthquakes that already happened this year on opposite sides of the world, because together they tell you everything about what this finding actually means for the millions of people living on top of it. The work came out of a research group associated with the University of Bern in Switzerland, and among the co-authors is Kate Scherer, a geologist with the United States Geological Survey, who has spent years reading the physical record of past California earthquakes. That detail matters, because the central challenge with any fault is that the thing you most want to know is invisible. You cannot see stress. You cannot put a gauge on a fault 12 miles underground and read off how close it is to failure. What you can do is reconstruct its history, and if you reconstruct enough of it, you can model where it stands today. To do that, the team built what they describe as a physics-based 4-dimensional model. The 4 dimensions are the 3 of space plus time, and the model was fed by 3 separate lines of evidence. The first was radiocarbon dating, which pins down when past ruptures disturbed the ground. The second was tree ring records, which can capture the fingerprints of historical earthquakes and the growth patterns of very old trees. The third was the documented history of known ruptures, the ones we have written records or clear geological scars for. Braided together, those 3 threads let the researchers run the clock backward across about 1,000 years, reconstructing when each segment of these faults moved, how much it moved, and therefore how much strain has been quietly rebuilding since. The reason this approach is powerful is that a single earthquake tells you very little on its own. One rupture is an anecdote, but 1,000 years of ruptures is a pattern, and a pattern lets you see the rhythm of a fault, the pace at which it loads and releases. Faults do not fail on a neat schedule, but over centuries they do settle into an average rhythm, a rough recurrence interval, and knowing where a fault stands within its own rhythm is far more useful than knowing only that it is capable of a large earthquake in the abstract. That is the leap this model makes. It does not just say these faults can produce a big one, it says where they are, right now, on the curve between one big one and the next. When the team laid the present day against that 1,000-year rhythm, the current moment did not sit somewhere comfortable in the middle of the range. It sat at the very top. By the model's own reconstruction, the system has not merely been building toward a dangerous level, it has, by this measure, already passed the highest point in the entire record. That is a subtle but important distinction. There is a difference between a fault that is approaching a threshold and a fault that has already climbed past every value the model can find in 1,000 years of history. The southern faults of California, according to this work, are in the second category. The strain that has to come out has already exceeded anything the reconstruction has on file. When you break the finding down segment by segment, one section stands out above all the others. The stretch of the San Jacinto fault that runs near San Bernardino registered the highest stress value anywhere in the 1,000-year reconstruction, at roughly 3.6 megapascals. That figure exceeds the segment's previous peak, which the model places about 50 years ago. So this is not a fault that has always been this loaded and simply never let go. It is a fault that has climbed to a new high, one it has not seen in centuries, and it is still climbing. Right beside it, the southern San Andreas tells a complementary story, and it is a story told by absence. The last time the southern San Andreas produced a major rupture was in the year 1857. an event known as the Fort Tejon earthquake, estimated at around magnitude 7.9. That was 169 years ago. In all the time since, the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate have been grinding past each other at roughly 5 centimeters a year, and none of the strain building on that southern stretch has been released in a major earthquake. Think about what that means. For over a century and a half, the fault has been winding tighter, one slow centimeter at a time, and it has not paid any of it back. The key insight of the study is not that either of these faults is overdue in isolation. Seismologists have known for years that the southern San Andreas is loaded, and the word overdue is one scientists tend to dislike anyway, because faults do not keep appointments. What is new, and what makes this finding genuinely different, is that both systems are at their highest stress at the same time, and that they run close enough together in one particular place to interact. A single loaded fault is a hazard we understand. Two loaded faults side by side, both near the top of their 1,000-year range and near enough to touch, is a different kind of problem. And the place where they come closest has a name. Cajon Pass is a mountain corridor roughly 50 miles northeast of downtown Los Angeles near San Bernardino. If you have ever driven Interstate 15 between Los Angeles and Las Vegas, you have gone straight through it. Beneath that pass, the San Andreas and the San Jacinto fault systems come very close to one another, and the study identifies this junction as something the researchers call an earthquake gate. Understanding what that term means is the whole ballgame, so let me walk through it. When an earthquake begins, the rupture does not always travel the entire length of a fault. It starts at a point and races along the fault line, and normally it stops when it reaches some kind of boundary, a place where the geometry changes or where the neighboring segment is carrying a different amount of stress. That boundary acts like a brake. It is the reason a lot of earthquakes stay contained to one segment rather than unzipping an entire fault system. The gate, in other words, is usually closed, but a gate can open. When two neighboring fault systems are loaded to similar, elevated levels at the same time, that boundary can stop functioning as a brake. Instead of halting the rupture, it lets it jump. A quake that begins on the San Andreas can leap the gap at Cajon Pass and continue onto the San Jacinto, or the reverse, chaining two separate faults into a single, far larger earthquake. What the study found is that the present stress conditions at Cajon Pass are precisely the conditions under which that jump becomes plausible. Because both systems are sitting near the top of their range at once, the brake is weak. The gate, in the model's language, is unlocked. And an unlocked gate is the difference between a serious regional earthquake and a catastrophe that hits several cities in the same violent minute. If a rupture were to jump that gate and string the two systems together, the researchers estimate the resulting earthquake could reach magnitude 7.4 to 7.8. To understand why that specific range is so alarming, you have to understand how the magnitude scale actually works, because it does not behave the way most people assume. The moment magnitude scale is logarithmic. Each whole step up the scale represents about 10 times the shaking amplitude and roughly 31 to 32 times the energy released. A magnitude 7.5 earthquake does not release a little more energy than a magnitude 6.5. It releases about 31 times more. Now place an earthquake of that size, not out in a remote desert, but running through the neighborhoods northeast of Los Angeles, along faults that pass beneath and beside dense population centers. A joint rupture in that magnitude range would not threaten a single city. It would threaten the Los Angeles basin, San Bernardino, Riverside County, and the Coachella Valley more or less at once, because the fault itself passes through all of them. This is what makes the earthquake gate scenario different from the standard picture of the big one that most Californians carry in their heads. It is not one fault failing in isolation. It is two, connected, releasing more than a century of stored strain across a wide swath of Southern California simultaneously. There is a second reason the length of a rupture matters, beyond the raw energy. A longer rupture shakes the ground for longer. A moderate earthquake might shake for a handful of seconds, but a great rupture that unzips segment after segment can shake for a minute or more. And buildings that could survive 10 seconds of violent motion begin to fail when that motion continues for 60. Duration is its own hazard, and a gate-jumping rupture that chains two systems together is, almost by definition, a longer and therefore a longer shaking event. The extra seconds are when weakened structures finally come down, when the soft first floors give way, and when the difference between a cracked wall and a collapse gets decided. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to hear a number like magnitude 7.8 and treat it as a prediction. It is not. The study does not say this earthquake is coming next week or next year. What it says is that the fault is now loaded to a degree that makes this scenario something to plan for, rather than something to file under remote worst cases. The stress is real, it is measured, and it is at a 1,000-year high. What the stress figure cannot tell you is the date, and that gap between knowing a fault is dangerously loaded and knowing when it will break is the single most important thing to understand about earthquake science, because it is the reason preparation matters so much more than prediction. Los Angeles is not a blank slate waiting to receive an earthquake. It is a specific city with specific vulnerabilities, and the study's finding matters precisely because of what sits on top of these faults. The metropolitan area holds more than 13 million people. Its building stock includes a large inventory of what engineers call soft-story buildings, apartment structures mostly from the 1960s and 70s, built with weak ground floors, often with open parking tucked underneath the living space. Those structures are known to perform badly in strong shaking, because the weak first floor can collapse and bring the floors above down with it. Utility lines, including gas mains, cross-active fault traces in multiple places, which is how shaking in the ground becomes fire in the streets. There is a more hopeful side to this ledger, and it is worth stating clearly. California has some of the strongest building codes in the world for new construction, and the region operates an early warning system called Shake Alert. That system works by detecting the fast-moving initial waves of an earthquake, the ones that do little damage, and sending an alert before the slower, more destructive waves arrive. Depending on how far you are from the epicenter, that can buy you anywhere from a few seconds to tens of seconds of warning. It does not sound like much, but it is enough time for a surgeon to lift a scalpel, for a train to begin braking, for a child to get under a desk. Seconds save lives. The problem is the gap between the new and the old. Modern buildings are engineered for this. The vulnerable older buildings, the soft-story apartments, and the unreinforced structures are being retrofitted slowly and unevenly, and the funding for that work has always been a political struggle. That gap between the buildings that will ride out a major rupture and the ones that will not is exactly where the human toll of this earthquake would concentrate. And that brings us to the part of this story that is not a model or a projection, but something that has already happened twice this year on opposite sides of the planet. On the 24th of June this year, two large earthquakes struck Venezuela within about 39 seconds of each other. The second and larger of the two measured magnitude 7.5, and both were shallow, at a depth of only about 10 kilometers. Depth is not a detail here. When a rupture is that shallow and sits directly beneath where people live, the energy reaches the surface with almost nothing to cushion it. In the coastal region, north of Caracas, reporting indicated that roughly 80% of buildings collapsed. As of early July, the confirmed death toll stood at around 3,500, with more than 16,000 injured and tens of thousands still unaccounted for, and independent observers described the real figure as substantially higher than the official count. That is what a magnitude 7.5 does when it strikes a place that was not built to survive it. Poverty, deferred maintenance, unenforced building standards, and no early warning system all stacked on top of one another, and when the ground moved, the buildings did not hold. The country was already in a humanitarian crisis before the earthquakes, its health system strained and its infrastructure fragile, which is another way of saying the disaster did not begin the moment the fault ruptured. It had been assembled, piece by piece, over years of conditions that made a survivable event unsurvivable. Hold that image, because now we are going to look at an earthquake of almost exactly the same size that produced an almost unrecognizably different result. The comparison is the whole point, and it is the reason the California study should be read, not as a death sentence, but as a warning that still leaves room for a choice. Earlier this year, a magnitude 7.4 earthquake struck off the Sanriku coast of northeastern Japan along the offshore trench that has produced some of the largest earthquakes in the country's history. It was, like the Venezuela event, shallow, at roughly 10 kilometers depth. It triggered tsunami warnings. Tens of thousands of people were told to evacuate. By every raw geological measure, this was a comparable event to what hit Venezuela, a magnitude 7 earthquake in the shallow crust near a populated coast. And here is what it did. 2 minor injuries, 0 deaths, 0 collapsed buildings. The difference was not luck, and it was not geology. It was decades of decisions made long before the ground ever moved. Japan has invested for generations in strict, continually updated seismic building codes. Its newer buildings sit on base isolation systems designed to let the ground move without tearing the structure apart. Its trains brake automatically when the shaking begins. Its schools run drills, its hospitals are built to keep functioning, and its early warning system gives people those precious seconds before the worst arrives. None of that is free, and none of it is accidental. Every base-isolated hospital and every automatic train brake represents money spent and rules enforced in the long years between earthquakes, when the ground was quiet and it would have been easy to spend the money elsewhere. That is the uncomfortable truth buried in the comparison. Preparation is expensive and invisible right up until the moment it becomes the only thing that mattered. 2 earthquakes, nearly identical in size and depth, and the death tolls differ by thousands. The variable was never the fault. The variable was the choices humans made about what to build and how. This is why the California finding matters the way it does. The study tells us the fault is loaded to a 1,000-year high. It cannot tell us whether Los Angeles, when the gate finally opens, will look like Japan or like Venezuela. California sits between those two poles. It has the codes and the warning system that Japan has, but it also has the old, unretrofitted buildings and the uneven preparation that turn a survivable earthquake into a mass casualty event. Which of those two outcomes plays out is not written in the rock. It is being decided right now in retrofit budgets and building inspections, and the choices people make about how ready they want to be. We should be precise about what this study establishes, because precision is what separates useful concern from useless panic. What the research establishes is that stress on multiple Southern California fault segments now equals or exceeds the highest value anywhere in a 1,000-year reconstruction, and that the Cajon Pass junction is loaded in a way that makes a joint rupture a scenario worth planning for. That is a strong, specific, measured finding. What the research does not do and cannot do is tell you when. Earthquake prediction, naming a date and a place and a magnitude in advance, remains impossible, and nothing in this work changes that. The researchers themselves are careful about this. The assessment quoted from the scientists framed the timing as today, tomorrow in 10 years, or in 30 years, intervals that at the scale of geology are indistinguishable from one another. Kate Scherer, the co-author from the United States Geological Survey, noted that the accumulated stress is enormous precisely because it has been so long since either of these systems had a major quake. That is the whole picture in a sentence. The longer the quiet, the larger the eventual release, and this quiet has lasted a very long time. The stress is a fact, the timing is a fog, and you cannot prepare for a date, so you prepare for a certainty. The one variable humans actually control is readiness. So let me end on the practical, because that is where this story stops being frightening and starts being useful. If you live anywhere in Southern California, the individual steps are not complicated and they are not expensive. Keep about 72 hours of water, food, first aid supplies, and any necessary medication on hand. Know where your gas shutoff is and how to use it, because gas lines crossing fault traces are how earthquakes become fires. Strap down your water heater and your heavy furniture. Have a family communication plan, because cell networks fail in the first minutes. And know your evacuation routes before you ever need them. What comes next is not a countdown to a specific day. It is a slow, quiet accumulation of strain on two faults that are already at their highest stress in 1,000 years, with the gate between them unlocked. The ground will move eventually, because that is what these faults do, and no study, however good, will tell us the morning it happens. But the death toll of an earthquake is not fixed by the earthquake. It is a geological event multiplied by 1,000 human decisions made in advance, and Venezuela and Japan showed us this year, in the starkest possible terms, that those decisions are the whole difference between a headline and a catastrophe. The fault is loaded. That part is out of our hands. What we build and how ready we are when it finally lets go is not.